This is episode 686 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Ilya Shapiro. He is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he was executive director and senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, and before that, vice president of the Cato Institute and director of Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. Shapiro is author of Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites. And for those watching on the ability to watch this, you can see the book there, and that is the primary topic of conversation we're going to have today here. So welcome to New Mexico, Ilya.
Great to be back with you, Paul.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. I don't know how many years ago it was, but you mentioned toys of toddlers on the floor at my house when you went there, and now my oldest daughter is 15, so that does give you a perspective on how long we've known each other.
And I didn't have kids, and now I have 4. So
yeah, and congratulations on that as well, and all these personal developments, and of course, inextricably entwined with the book you've written here, "Lawless: The Miseducation of America's Elites," is a personal story. But introduce yourself. Talk a little bit about what attracted you to the Cato Institute, and then a little bit about your move over to Georgetown. And we don't have to get into the big controversy until you want to, but you've obviously been at it for a while, and the Cato Institute's a very like-minded organization. So let's start with that.
Well, I'm at the Manhattan Institute now, Paul.
And I know. We're going to work our way through. Yes.
Right. So I was born in Moscow, Russia, and my parents got me out, thankfully, because they didn't want me growing up under communism. We immigrated to Canada when I was little. And very early on, I was kind of nerdy, but I was big for my age and played sports, so I didn't get beat up. But I did realize fairly early on, precociously, that I preferred life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness to peace, order, and good government, the Canadian equivalent motto. And so I dreamed of coming to the U.S., which I finally did when I went to college at Princeton and law school at the University of Chicago. But it's really hard to come to the U.S. legally, and so it took me quite a while to eventually secure a green card. Cato helped with that. I joined Cato in 2007 after I think 3 years between 2 firms in big law. I was not meant for corporate law. Joined Cato and have been in the public policy space ever since, and I love having a job that lets me work at the intersection of the legal, political, academic, and media world. So on top of the substantive variety, you think about the different things that have been in the national constitutional debate or before the Supreme Court in the last 20 years. In addition, just the functional difference where sometimes I wear a professor's hat, sometimes I'm a pundit, sometimes I'm a regular old lawyer, and sometimes I'm not sure what. But it's been a wild ride, and I eventually did become American, naturalized just over 10 years ago, and also got married, had these 4 kids, and we live in Falls Church outside of Washington. And at a certain point, after almost 15 years at Cato, I thought, well, how else can I have an impact? And I got this opportunity from Randy Barnett, a storied libertarian law professor at Georgetown, to head up his Center for the Constitution, which we'll get into. We've since learned is an important center because the rest of the law school is the center against the Constitution.
Yeah. So you start off at Cato. You're there for a decade and a half, and then Randy Barnett, who he is a very well known and well respected attorney, pro-liberty kind of guy. I know he's worked on the Obamacare cases, I believe, and a few others.
The New York Times called him the godfather of the constitutional challenge to Obamacare.
Yeah. So definitely somebody who's great to have on your side. But you go over to Georgetown, and for those familiar with the D.C. area, you've got the main campus of Georgetown, which is in Georgetown. But Georgetown law is hop, skip, and a jump from
It's
Cato, really.
yeah, it's on Massachusetts. It's not far from Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it wasn't that I joined Georgetown. In fact, it was 4 days before I was due to join Georgetown, to have this new direction in my life, to teach and advocate for originalism and all these other things, a different kind of opportunity from being at a think tank. That was when news of Justice Stephen Breyer's retirement broke. And I had written my last book, Supreme Disorder, still available. You can get a good deal on Amazon, about the judicial politics and Supreme Court nomination battles and things like that. So I was doing a lot of media, putting out statements and such about the confirmation battle to come. And that night, I was on the road. I was in Austin, Texas. Had celebrated a friend's career transition, actually, as well, and I was festive and feisty, and got back to my hotel room, and not a best practice was doom scrolling Twitter and getting more and more upset that President Biden was hewing to his campaign promise to appoint a black woman. Nothing wrong with putting a black woman on the Supreme Court, but I just felt you shouldn't restrict your candidate pool, whether you're hiring for janitor or justice, by race and sex. And I tweeted out a hot take that, if I was a Democratic president, I'd pick the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, the second most prestigious, powerful court in the land. Happened to be an Indian-American immigrant, name of Sri Srinivasan. But Judge Srinivasan was disqualified at the get-go because of today's prevailing hierarchy of intersectionality, as I put it. And we'd be left with what in Twitter's limited character space I inartfully phrased as a lesser black woman. Fired that off, went to bed, and all hell broke loose overnight. I woke up, and my ideological enemies were out for my head.
Yeah, and I remember when all this was going on. This was reported in national media outlets from sea to shining sea, and definitely they were not kind, shall we say? So you ultimately never really, as you mentioned, I incorrectly stated that you actually worked at Georgetown. You never technically.
I guess I technically did for 4 days. So
4 days.
So
Okay.
what happened? I mean, it was not these 4 days. Initially, it was the 4 days of hell, as I characterized it, where I felt my entire life was crumbling. All the sacrifices my parents made in getting me out of the Soviet Union, my hard work over decades, all of it tumbling down over a tweet. And to be clear, this is because I was trying to get onto the left's turf. If I had just been at Cato commenting, I mean, whatever,
Right.
Right-wing lunatic is racist again, who cares, right? But since I was trying to join Georgetown, it was a huge kerfuffle, and I was patient zero of cancel culture at its peak, perhaps in January 2022. Ultimately, the dean, Bill Traynor of Georgetown, no profile in courage, he did not fire me, nor did he say, I don't like what he said, I don't agree with it, but we have speech protections, which Georgetown does. On paper, their policy is fantastic. Instead, he punted to the DEI office, the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, to investigate me. So I was onboarded and immediately suspended. And they were going to investigate whether I was violating harassment and discrimination policies. And that 4 days of hell became 4 months of purgatory, farce, really. After the first little while, it became clear that this was just a bizarro land. And at the end of which, somebody at the high-priced law firm that Georgetown hired to advise them looked at a calendar and realized that I had not been employed by Georgetown when I tweeted, so these policies didn't apply. So I was reinstated on this jurisdictional technicality, if you will. I was employed by Georgetown in an unsuspended state for 4 days, but the problem was I got this report from the DEI office, which said that the next time I said something that offended someone, I'd be back in the Inquisition. And I realized that I couldn't do the job that I was hired to do under such conditions, because I'd be commenting both internally and externally on Supreme Court controversies and other things that clearly would put me in the crosshairs. So I did what lawyers call make a noisy exit, and published my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal, as one does, announced my move to the Manhattan Institute, think tank based in Manhattan, although I didn't move. I still live in Northern Virginia. I announced that move on Fox News, and away we went. It was very gratifying to control the media cycle for about 2 weeks. I didn't ask to be the poster boy for cancel culture or woke academia or what have you, but I've been using this platform I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia. And out of all of that, out of my so-called lived experience, I've used that as a jumping off point to write this book.
So before we get to the book, and that's definitely coming up here next, Manhattan Institute, of course, in many ways, not ideologically necessarily similar to Cato, but what are you doing now at Manhattan, aside from writing this book, et cetera? But, is it a similar role, would you say, to what you were doing at Cato, or do you see it moving in a different direction? Of course, Manhattan's a very prominent organization. Christopher Rufo, I believe one of our past guests, Judge Glock, is there.
Heather McDonald,
yeah.
Abigail Schreier, and Douglas Murray we just picked up. I'm only the fifth most controversial person there now. MI is a dynamic place. It's broadly center right. So Cato was libertarian. Right. MI certainly has libertarians, but it's broadly center right. And unlike pretty much any other center right think tank, it focuses on cities, which is, after all, where most Americans live. And so there's a lot of coverage of housing and education and urban decay and policing and these sorts of bread and butter urban issues, including in our wonderful quarterly magazine, City Journal, which I've been reading for 25 years, long before I started working for MI. I think it's a fantastic product, now online as well, of course. So I run the Amicus program, as I did at Cato. And in fact, the expert on Supreme Court analytics, of course there is such a thing, Adam Feldman, in kind of tracking the stats and looking at the shift in quantity and influence or what have you of amicus briefs, noticed that the relative filings of Cato versus MI changed, and he dubbed this the Ilya Shapiro effect of when I went over. So I'm happy to be doing that. A lot more, ideological differences or what have you, nuances aside, MI does a lot more kind of fighting in Culture War 3.0, government affairs. I meet a lot with state attorneys generals and their offices, legislators, executive branch officials, trying to advance our model legislation, or just be a lot more on the ground. And I've authored or co-authored several bits of model legislation as well, which I hadn't done at Cato. So it's been an interesting dynamic that way. But in many respects, it's similar. I'm still writing op-eds. I'm still touring the country, debating law professors or giving speeches to donors or business groups or other interesting public affairs organizations. People ask me, am I going to New York all the time? And the answer is, maybe a little more than when I was at Cato, but frankly, I'm going to Florida a lot, because that's where a lot of the donor base is, and that's where a lot of the policy energy has shifted, at least from the Northeast.
All right. Well, we can maybe dive into a little bit more on some of the issues you're working on at Manhattan. And it is an exciting institution these days, a lot of interesting people, but let's get into Lawless, again, the miseducation of America's elites. And, I have not had the chance to read this yet. We're knee deep in our legislative session. In addition to this podcast, I'm, of course, speaking to the Federal Society chapter tomorrow as we record this. And so you'll get to hear a summary a couple of times now, Paul. Yes, but I encourage folks to check out this book. People probably won't be able to listen to it in time we don't even have space open for lunch tomorrow. So what am I saying? He's a luncheon speaker on Friday, the 21st of February, and talking about, again, some of those biographical things, but of course, Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Elites, which focuses heavily on higher education, especially the the issues that you
especially
saw.
law schools.
Yes, and so,
And that's not because I'm a lawyer chauvinist, Paul. It's because as bad or sad as runaway English or sociology departments are, as not good as that is for
mhm.
the kind of development of human knowledge and what have you. Um, Law school is going off the rails, has a much more direct, practical impact on the world. Lawyers, after all, are the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions, not just judges and prosecutors and defense lawyers and corporate counsel and things like that, but overrepresented among politicians and among business executives and things like that. So if these lawyers are being acculturated to cancel people who's not listen to people whose views they don't like, to think that the entire structure of the law is illegitimate and needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. I mean, this really attacks the pillars on which American liberty and prosperity is built.
So it's worth noting before we get started that Georgetown is, at least theoretically, a private institution. It's a Jesuit institution. As a
Nominally.
practicing Catholic, I grew up, knowing all these kinds of things. But yeah, higher education is not exactly. There's a few truly religious institutions, and some of them are Catholic. But yeah, Georgetown is pretty off the rails in terms of any adherence to Catholic doctrine. Let's just say that. And I'm sure that distance grows even further once you get to the law school side of things. But talk about the issue as it stands. What are the problems, especially with our law schools like Georgetown, and just lay out the issue that you address in the book?
The I boil it down to three kinds of failures: a failure of ideology, of bureaucracy, and of leadership. So, when I was in law school over 20 years ago now, it's odd to think, we had heard about critical legal studies and critical theory. This idea that institutions are illegitimate because they have built into them irrevocably these unjust power dynamics, the oppressor class over the oppressed class, the racial majority over the minority, men over women, all of these different dimensions of oppression, and so they have to be torn down, deconstructed, and then reconstructed according to a new privilege hierarchy or intersectional matrix or what have you. Um, uh, that kind of postmodern thinking, we had heard about this. This was something from the 80s and early 90s, but it had been relegated back to some dark niche of a sociology department or something. But then it came roaring back, maybe about 10 years ago or so. And that's an issue because, especially in the law, if not just constitutional law or civil rights law or what have you, but water regulation and securities and contracts and all of these kind of seemingly non-political touchstones are themselves imbued with racist heteropatriarchy or whatever you want to call it, and therefore should be completely redone, then that's a problem. If you have lawyers who uh, uh, don't want to understand originalism because that's dead white men who are slave owners and things like that, that's a problem. You're not going to be effective as a lawyer, first of all, and you're making the whole system worse along the way. That's a big failure of law schools, that they're not teaching their students to look at all sides of an issue. So anyway, that's the failure of ideology. That's accentuated by the bureaucracy. So as bad as the faculty is, and the discrimination in viewpoint and ideology and hiring, that's darn near impossible as a non-progressive to get hired at a law school, particularly at a so-called elite one. I think at Georgetown, I would have been like number 3.5 or something like that out of a faculty of 150. But as bad as what's going on with the faculty is, the non-teaching staff are arguably worse. Um, there are now in every university in the country more administrators, more staff than faculty. They've grown at a tremendous rate, faster than faculty, faster than student bodies. I mean, in some places there are more administrators than students. The joke is that 100 years ago, Yaleys came to campus with their own butlers. Maybe now these educrats are going to be the personal butlers, which in effect they are, because it's student services and hand holding to process the traumas of election results that don't go their ways and things like this. The safetyism and the adapting kind of behavioral psychology, so that when someone says something that challenges your preconceived notion, that's a harm that you have to be taken to a safe space to get away from, so that you're not triggered. All of this weird stuff that comes from the bureaucracy, not the faculty. And in the last decade, almost all of that bureaucratic growth has been in the DEI space, which I want to be clear on this. The words diversity, equity, inclusion, there's nothing wrong with them. They're actually good, healthy words. You want to have people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, bringing their different viewpoints to the table. That makes for a better educational experience, prevents groupthink and decision making, etc. Equity is a centuries old concept in Anglo-American law that, in layman's terms, boils down to treating people fairly. Inclusion, why wouldn't you want people to feel comfortable in their place of employment or education?
Well, hold on. Let me circle back to equity, because of course that is arguably the term that really gives everything away, because there was a famous, I believe, interview with Kamala Harris during the campaign, or maybe it was before the campaign before she became the candidate, in which she explained that equity, at least in the modern sense, and I don't know, maybe the term's changed, maybe it's always had this as a sub-meaning, but it means equality of outcomes, not equality more broadly speaking.
Of opportunity. Absolutely. Yeah. That's the problem. These innocuous or even positive terms have been perverted or are used by the diversity industrial complex to prevent intellectual diversity, to not advance equal opportunity, but indeed equality of outcome, and to exclude anyone who deviates from this kind of orthodoxy. That is DEI in a nutshell as it's practiced. And so when you have these administrators who run orientation sessions, who investigate allegations of political incorrectness, and generate there's a huge demand to justify their own existence and grow their budgets, and so they there's not enough of a supply of actual racism or sexism or what have you, so they generate it, and then they investigate it, and they adjudicate it, and they punish it, and to the detriment of some such foundational classical liberal or higher education values as free speech, due process, equality under the law. I mean, these things in some of these DEI trainings are called tropes of white supremacy. So that's a huge problem, that this bureaucratic bloat, not just the amount of money spent on it, but the perversion of campus cultures. And the sad thing is, or the ironic, or the sardonic, the bitter irony of all of this is that these offices fail on their own terms. That is, campus surveys, climate surveys show that measures of student belonging or inclusion generally, or comfort with diversity specifically, tends to be inversely proportional to the size and budgets of these offices. So they are value subtracting institutions within these universities and law schools. And then finally, the third bit is the failure of leadership, because these kinds of illiberal wins, and I do again want to emphasize that this is not the latest iteration of a decades old conservative complaint about hippies taking over the faculty lounge. I mean, those hippies, the Berkeley free speech movement, would be considered by today's radicals retrograde white supremacists. But these, this is something new, and those illiberal winds could be stopped if there was good leadership. But deans, presidents, provosts, department chairs, it's not that they themselves are woke radicals or social justice warriors. They're spineless cowards. They're careerist bureaucrats who try to climb the greasy pole and try to mollify these illiberal mobs rather than standing up for values of civil discourse or rule of law, equal protection, due process, all of these very basic things. The search for truth, the fundamental core mission of any institution of higher education. And so things have gone off the rails. Too few university leaders follow the example of the late University of Chicago president, Bob Zimmer, who, for example, when he was pushed to discipline Professor Dorian Abbott for criticizing affirmative action, said, look, we have policies that give our faculty the freedom to criticize our own policies. And I'm not going to be engaged in speech policing. You want to write a letter to the editor of the school paper, do something on a blog, do whatever, have a protest. That's up to you. But don't come to me looking to police other speech. Too few university leaders followed the example of Vanderbilt Chancellor Daniel Diermeier, who, when students occupied his office last year, kicked them out and expelled them, just basically enforcing standard rules and getting national plaudits for meeting that low bar. So out of all of these failures, we have the current situation of speaker shoutdowns and students graduating not understanding how to zealously represent their client, understand different aspects of an issue, calling for, the best Supreme Court lawyer in the country, Paul Clement, to be fired from his firm because he won a Supreme Court case involving the Second Amendment. Can't have that. Things, just bizarre things that go on in Canada, in California, movements to sentence people based on their race for the same, given the same crime and the same criminal history, different punishments based on race. All of these things that really are perverting the law.
All right, so let's dive into a little bit on higher education, especially because for yours and my lifetimes, we've always known colleges are bastions of left-wing political thought. And I've always thought, and I'm sure you agree with this as, libertarian or whatever you describe yourself, but you worked at Cato, so we'll throw the libertarian tag at you.
I've always called myself a classical liberal. In fact,
Fair
I
enough.
got the job at Cato in an initial lunch, which I didn't really realize was a job interview, but Roger Pilon, the founder of Cato's Center for Constitutional Studies, took me to lunch and asked me, so are you a libertarian or a conservative or what? And I said, well, I like to say classical liberal. And later on, we ended up talking for 3 hours, but he said that I got the job with the answer to that first question.
Fair enough. So, I think we can agree, though, that government funding at a massive scale, government ownership and management of institutes of higher learning is a fundamental problem with higher education. But it's by no means, obviously, the only problem when it comes to our law schools or higher education.
It also gives us levers for reform.
That is true. So that's kind of where I'm going in terms of some of this. And obviously, Georgetown, even though it is a private institution, is heavily funded through government programs. I'm a little less because I never did go to law school. Unlike yourself, I have an MBA from the University of Maryland, actually, College Park, so DC area school. But you don't get quite the number of lefties there at the business school. What is that the most fundamental way to approach this, is to take on the funding and try to cut these institutions loose from direct government funding? Or would you say it's some other fundamental approach that needs to be undertaken?
I'm always for all of the above solutions. So there's lots of avenues to attack. Everything from something that's often under the radar of accreditation reform, for example. With law schools, this is particularly pernicious because the ABA, the American Bar Association, which has long become just another left-wing interest group, which I think its membership is now down to about 12 or 13% of lawyers nationally, down from nearly everyone, 80 years ago, something like that. Or Lewis Powell parlayed being the president of the ABA into a Supreme Court seat. Now nobody knows or cares who the ABA president is. But anyway, they have a monopoly over accreditation, which is a problem because they're enforcing all sorts of bad things. So that needs to be reformed. Employers saying, we're not going to hire students who support Hamas or who scream at federal judges that we hope that your daughters get raped, as happened to Kyle Duncan at Stanford Law School a couple of years ago. State legislatures, these are the levers. Simply for public schools, abolishing the DEI offices, saying there shall be no ideological litmus test, diversity statements for hiring, doing things like that. At the federal level, there are lots of federal strings to these funds. We don't need new laws to add more strings, but whether you're talking about civil rights enforcement with respect to anti-Semitism, with respect to treating people differently based on race, whether you're talking about students' free speech rights or their due process rights. The new education department, we're now a month into the second Trump administration, has launched investigations into a number of schools for violating all of those kinds of protections for their students. And the ultimate threat has to be the withholding or even clawing back of those funds. And that does scare university leaders. So that is an important component of this. And alumni and donors and trustees. These kinds of forces, when after October 7th, so many schools showed their anti-Semitic colors, donations to Harvard and Columbia and Penn, for example, dropped. And the disastrous testimony of the university presidents, that can and will have an impact, as well as alternative institutions. So the University of Austin, for example, just this year has its first cohort of students. I spoke there a few weeks ago. Very interesting experiment. You also have new institutions within existing schools, new civic centers or centers for excellence or what have you. I don't know if that's going on at New Mexico yet, but Arizona State and Florida State, UNC, all of these places are kind of experimenting with new ways to give students what they want, what they're thirsting for. And so we've seen a dynamic where, I think the Wall Street Journal covered this in their news section a few months ago, applications are down in Northeastern schools and up in SEC schools, as students and their parents want to avoid what I call the colds and the scolds.
So New Mexico's a blue state, and if you haven't already been informed of this, I will just go out on a limb and tell you that UNM Law School is extremely left-wing, and we have Democrats that dominate the legislature and are in the governor's office. Obviously, a Republican governor could come in and kind of move some of the, try to push on the law school and see what they can do, but ultimately they'll just wait them out and continue to go back to wherever what they are doing. Is it simple as having people like Ron DeSantis, who are in charge of the education budgets, including higher ed, really tackle this issue? Or, I know we're talking top down, bottom up, and I want to talk about individual law students next, but we're starting with the top down. Is this something that it really is up to?
Governance matters.
Yeah.
Absolutely, governance matters. Florida was the quintessential swing state for a long time. DeSantis won his first election by like 0.05% or something, and he's, through the sheer force of good governance, has turned it into a safe red state. Who knows after he leaves whether that will continue, depending on who follows. but governance and governors do matter. But I mentioned lots of other actors. The federal government has those strings attached. Employers, and if New Mexico employers don't care and that they're satisfied with the types of students that the law school here is producing, well, then they're getting what they're paid for. But I imagine at the margins, if whoever UNM's competitors are, whether that's the Arizona schools, the Colorado schools, what have you, probably more competition in the non legal sectors that are being felt, then the universities are going to feel market forces acting on them as their donations drop, as their student applications drop.
All right, so let's get to students. So some young person out there, maybe not young person, but somebody looking to attend law school and they live right here in New Mexico.
Now why would someone do that?
Why would you attend law school? I don't know.
right.
That's a good question. I never.
No, people come up to me and want to talk about law schools, and I liken this to converting to Judaism. You kind of turn them away several times, and if they keep coming back, you say, "Okay, sit down. Let's talk about this." Because you have to go first of all for the right reason. It's not there are a lot of heavily indebted, miserable lawyers out there. These tend to be the type of people that go to law school because they don't know what else they want to do with their life. It sounds like a prestigious degree. It sounds like a quote unquote versatile degree. So let's do it. Well, look, it's comes at a high cost, not just the tuition and housing and all that, the actual price tag of attending law school, but the opportunity cost. You can be doing lots of other things in those 3 years. You could be working at a startup. You could be getting an MBA. You could be, who knows, traveling around the world. You could be, trying to make it in the entertainment industry. Who knows, right? Helping out your family business. So there's lots of things that you could be doing instead of doing this very hard thing, which a lot of people find boring, for example. I mean, again, law school is not for everyone, and you should do it only if you can answer the question of what kind of law do you want to practice, and you get into a good enough school, frankly. So if look at where, take the LSAT if you're thinking about law school. See where that places you. Where that your LSAT score is the median at which school. Would that school satisfy you? And it depends where you want to be. Because if you want to be in Albuquerque, then there's no reason for you to prefer, I don't know where UNM is ranked, but there's no reason for you to prefer, some school that's ranked 20 points higher, but happens to be, in Minnesota or Alabama or something. That's not going to get you a job in New Mexico. So you have to be savvy. And in a lot of places, having a Harvard or Yale or Chicago degree won't be that much of an advantage rather than having spent 3 years in this market networking. So again, you have to think about where you want to. Do you want to be at a major metropolis, a mid-sized city? Do you want to be a prosecutor? Do you want to be at a big corporate law firm? All of these things will determine what sort of law school you should go to if you can get into it, and then don't go if you can't get into that kind of law school. What kind of money are they giving you? There are market signals, and it's often better to go to a slightly lower ranked school that gives you more money than a higher ranked school. So there's so many considerations.
All right. Well, I will answer one of your questions, which is U.S. News and World Report ranks University of New Mexico Law School 94th out of 196 law schools in the nation. So, considering where New Mexico generally ranks, that's not altogether shabby, right about in the middle, but that is what it is. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I do want to ask, one further question, which is, are there, we've got our Hillsdale colleges, I know Ron DeSantis is doing some things down in Florida with broader education issues. Obviously, for attorneys and wannabe attorneys, I'm sure there are some more kind of not free market, but I don't know, what would you call them? Constitutionally on point law schools.
Yeah.
Are there law schools that you think rise above some of these issues?
Well, my alma mater, the University of Chicago, is probably the best, almost certainly the best of the so-called elite cohort. UVA is doing okay.
University of Virginia
University
for
of
those.
Virginia.
Yeah.
Notre Dame.
Another Catholic school, but maybe a little more adhering
maybe
to
more actually Catholic. George Mason, Antonin Scalia Law School in the D.C. suburbs in Arlington, Virginia, plays Moneyball. That is, they have a lot of professors who, by all rights, in terms of their reputation, citation counts, things like that, should be at like top 5 or 10 schools. But because of discrimination against conservatives and libertarians, they're not. And Scalia Law picks them up, and so you can get just the best legal education there, and it's right in the D.C. metro area if that interests you.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for that little list. And no, I'm not looking to go to law school. My mom wanted me to be a lawyer, and I chose a different path. But I guess I liked arguing a lot, so I do that plenty at the Rio Grande Foundation.
You know, my wife's a lawyer, and people are like, people say two things about that. I mean, it's very common in DC because, you know, half the people are lawyers anyway. But first, well, of course, you know, a lawyer is the only person who could tolerate another lawyer. And secondly, don't you guys just argue all the time? And the answer is, well, maybe, but it's not like our understanding of the Commerce Clause is going to help adjudicate a dispute between our 9-year-old and our 7-year-old or something like that. Or, you know, one of us criticizing the other's, you know, spending patterns or cleanliness or something like that. So that's, you know, that's not quite the same. But it is cool to have someone on the same wavelength that you can kind of. We even sometimes have worked on the same cases or the same issues as she's been in the government, or I filed a brief supporting her case now that she's back in private practice. So, you know, lawyers in love, very romantic.
Very cool. Well, maybe you could put one of those wigs on one of your children and have them adjudicate the family arguments between.
I do have little foam gavels for them. It's very cute.
Very good. Anything else you want to discuss about the book or other issues relating to you know, these kinds of issues that we're talking about?
We've just passed the first month of the new Trump administration and a flurry of executive orders, some of which directly go to the issues that I discuss in terms of getting rid of DEI or being faithful to the Supreme Court's ruling outlawing racial preferences in admission, certain things about gender theory and defining sex for Title IX purposes. We'll see what happens with that, and if the Department of Education and the Justice Department follows through on enforcement, if we can actually get some legislation, because if you live by the executive action, you die by the executive action. But we're definitely in a different policy environment for all of this stuff than we were a year ago.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and welcome back to New Mexico, Ilya Shapiro. No seats at the event, but you know, we'll be doing Bob Clark in addition to this particular show. So got plenty of we're keeping you busy while you're here. So thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.